The phone lit up like an accusation, a small rectangle on the coffee table, the glow catching the silver hair of the lamp, and there it was in plain clinical type. Available balance, $0. My son cleared my bank account and took off with his wife and mother-in-law. I smiled. Ellie Price did not laugh. The smile she wore was a blade, thin, private, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. She folded her hands in her lap, where the chamomile tea had gone cold, listened to the kettle's little ring dying away in the kitchen, and let the silence do some of her thinking for her. Her armchair, the one with a permanent crescent worn into the left arm from years of mending sweaters while keeping an eye on the street, had been her observatory for decades. It had seen scraped knees, bad report cards, first dates, and the night she sat sleepless after a divorce that felt like a house collapsing. It had also watched her hold Jackson as a newborn, whispering promises she did not think she would ever have to keep. The Instagram photo came just after the bank message, as if someone had timed the world to twist the knife. Jackson, arms slung around a woman with too much lipstick and a laugh that showed her teeth, standing in front of the Trevi fountain. Confetti in the air, a plate of pasta in the foreground, and in the corner of the square picture, Tanya's mother smiling like a queen who has just learned a secret. Ellie blinked. The red notebook she kept on her side table, a slim volume the color of a cherry jam jar, filled with neat lines, calculations, dates, and, if anyone else read it, secrets, was heavy beneath her palm. She ran her thumb over the cover. The notebook had a way of focusing her. She opened it and found the small, untidy list she had written that morning. Milk, stamps, call to bank about checkbook. Now she added, in a hand that did not shake, bank, available, $0. She was 71 years old, though she never said that aloud. Her neighbors rounded down when they talked to her, and her hair had the white silver of a moonlit field. People in her little street still called her Ellie the way the children who had lived across from her once did, a concession to decades of presence. She had worked before she had to, worked twice as hard when she didn't because Jackson came first. She had sold land to keep him in school. She had pawned an old ring she had never worn to pay for a bus so Jackson could get to a job interview across town. She had thought the small debts paid in love and midnight prayers. There was the faint smell of lemon polish in the air, a reminder that the house was still hers. She could list the things she owned and where she kept them, the chip saucer with the fox painted on it in the bottom shelf of the kitchen hutch, the oilcloth apron with the paint splatter she used when she cleaned out the attic, the armchair inherited in a stack of boxes after her mother's death. She could not list anymore the contents of her bank account. Someone else had done that. Doris, she said aloud before she had meant to. It was a small contact, a neighbor who walked her terrier twice a week and who had a phone like a small, chatty animal, always alert to new things. Doris had been the one to point to the phone across her own garden that afternoon. Ellie, look, your grandson, Rome. And then to watch the change in Ellie's face until the history of their street had become animated with pity. Doris had seen the photo first and guessed, wrongly, she would later apologize, that Jackson was finally making his way in the world. To Doris, it read like triumph. To Ellie, with the bank's stark message still sitting like a frost on her palm, it read like proof. She thumbed through statements on the banking app with the careful slowness of someone handling a relic. Each line was the same, transfers marked with a few terse descriptions, amounts that, when added together, formed the life she'd thought she'd saved. Paying for her small house, for the roof patch last winter, for a neighbor's medication now and then. The total hit like a harvest bill at the end of a season. When she called the bank, the woman on the other end of the line used the language of procedure. There was a joint account. There had been a change of address form with an updated identification attached. Someone had signed. The voice suggested that there were ways they could look into it, that there were forms to fill, that there might be a mistake. Ellie listened as though listening to rain on the roof. She hung up, made a note in her red book, joint account suspicious, then went to the chest beneath the armchair and pulled out the manila envelope that had been taped and untaped more times than she could count. She had kept it because she couldn't bear to throw away the things Jackson left behind. A tiny concert ticket from the year he turned 16, a photograph of him with a cowlick that refused to be tamed, a year's worth of school essays scrawled with the kind of failure and hope that only a mother could tenderly archive. The envelope was creased and smelled faintly of cedar. The will she had tucked there years ago when she had been afraid of something she could not name was folded within. She had kept a spare copy at the bank too, bound and thumbed. Now, because of an instinct older than fear, she opened the will and skimmed for signatures. Her name was inked with a shakier hand than she remembered. The witness lines carried names she did not know. Betrayal is often messy in small domestic ways. It is not always dramatic. It can be a series of receipts left in a kitchen drawer, a pattern of excuses that sit so comfortably next to one another they begin to look like truth. Tanya had come into their lives with the skill of a practiced sunbeam, warm at first, then undeniable. She was younger than Jackson, with a laugh that filled rooms and an appetite for the good things. Restaurants, shoes, flights taken at a moment's notice. Rhonda, her mother, carried a sharper edge. She had the kind of fierce smile people could misread as kindness. They nested together in the kind of hush that always belonged to the privileged. Secret calls, short messages, something unsaid but very heavy. Ellie had seen Jackson's happiness the way a person watches weather, curious at first, then worried when the barometer kept falling. Jackson would come home with stories and lighter pockets, and then the pockets grew lighter still. He stopped calling sometimes. He started asking for help twice as often as he used to. Once, when his shoes were literally falling apart, Ellie had opened her closet and handed him a pair she had kept for a visitor. He shrugged and told her not to worry, that things were changing. She made him stew and bread, mended the heel with a practiced needle, and pretended she didn't notice he was not sleeping in his room anymore. She thought about the morning Jackson arrived with a paper in his hand, some form she remembered, looking unimportant, and a grin like a child who had just learned how to climb a tree. "Mom," he had said, "they need a signature." He put down a pen. She had signed. She trusted him because trust was a fabric woven into every contract they had with one another, because she had raised him out of small, ordinary dangers into a man who could carry his own weight. The stitches of their life were a century's worth of habits. Now those stitches were unraveling, thread by thread. Ellie did not rage. She catalogued. She took the photograph of Jackson and the two women on her phone and compared the date stamp to the bank transfer. She wrote the figure in her notebook. She found a line of transaction descriptors that said something ordinary, family support, and then another that read, simply, transfer. There was one transaction large enough to make a dent in her bronchial prayer life. She circled it with a pen that had been her father's. Brenda arrived that evening as she always did when the week felt like a stone. Brenda was a neighbor who had once been an accountant and had since retired into the quiet tyranny of crosswords and pruning. She treated numbers the way people treat family photographs, with patience and a little nostalgia. Brenda sat at Ellie's kitchen table with her bag of receipts and a serious frown. The house smelled of lemon polish and chamomile, and the kettle ticked faintly like a metronome. "You don't have to do this alone," Brenda said. Not as a kindness, but like a fact. She had keys to a bank attorney, she said. She knew how to print statements in ways the bank couldn't quite argue with. She could, if Ellie wanted, trace the transfers as far as the feed would allow. Walter, she added, would be able to look at the signatures. Walter. The name was a small bell tugging at memory. She had known Walter Price once, years ago, before he retired into a house with a garden full of roses and an office packed with old law books. He had once been the man who had drafted a will for Ellie's mother. He had been careful and kind. He was, as Brenda said, softer, good with the kind of people who thought they could make documents do what they wanted. Ellie made tea the way she did when she wanted to think clearly, steep long enough for color to hint the name of sleep, then pour into a thick china mug that fit in her hands like a soft promise. She told Brenda everything, but she left out the part that felt like an old wound becoming new, the embarrassment of being taken. "You don't look like someone who would rely on other people who do this sort of thing," Brenda said at last, looking straight at Ellie. "They'd need—" She trailed off into a list of things that Ellie felt like a novice hearing spoken aloud. Forged signatures, false identification, joint account applications. It was ordinary in a way that made betrayal feel bureaucratic. "We will do it right," Brenda promised. "We will not be loud. We'll be methodical. We'll make them answer." Ellie nodded. Her jaw moved once, as if to speak, and then found no words sturdy enough. The red notebook instead answered. She opened to the back where she kept a page titled Names for Later. She wrote, Jackson Arthur Price, Tanya Merle, Rhonda S., no surname. She wrote the amount, the date, the bank code, and in a small private corner, find Walter. The thing about practical plans is that they anchor a person. Where fury would have scattered her into loud places where words do not heal, a plan gave her a footprint. She had been building a life of small, resilient structures for decades, repairing a leak before it became a flood, saving a little coffee for a rainy week, calling a neighbor when the moon looked too big for the roof. This was like that. She would file complaints. She would let the law work. She would not mock or shout. She would let the truth do the hard lifting. But for all the planning, grief was still a current under her breakfast table. Jackson was not just a line on a balance sheet. He was a child who once made mud pies, and then later, in the spaces between, a man who made choices. She thought of the night she had sat on the top step to kiss a fevered forehead, the afternoon she had given him a quarter to buy an apple when she couldn't afford the lunch his friends ate. She thought of the way she had smoothed his hair the night he left for the city with nothing but ambition and a backpack. She had imagined this as a life that would loop back into kindness. Betrayal had not been on the map. That night she made a list in the notebook. Not a list of vengeance, no. The word she wrote was smaller, cleaner. Account. Protect. She drew a line down the middle. On one side, legal steps. On the other, personal things to preserve. Photographs, letters, the yellow envelope she had kept for 3 decades in case there came a time when the child she had raised needed to see proof of home. She ran her finger under the lettering until the ink smudged like a bruise. The next morning, Doris pounded on her door with the energy of someone delivering gossip and milk. "Ellie, there's talk on the block. People saw Tanya on the market with a new bag. Have you seen the photo?" Doris's voice carried the kind of sharp curiosity a small town cultivates. Ellie showed her the phone. Doris's face softened as the photo went round in her head. "Oh dear," she said softly. "Oh." They were not cruel. The neighbors had always been the kind of people who kept their hands at the ready for casseroles, for broken heaters in January, for afternoons when the city bus forgot to show up. The community had held Ellie in practical ways she didn't always notice, lending a set of bowls when a neighbor's grandson got married, bringing over a loaf of bread when winter made everything feel a little more precarious. That community now leaned like a wind to steady her. On a Wednesday that smelled of clean laundry and rain, Ellie went to see Walter. He had made a small garden of white roses around his porch and moved slower than she remembered. Time had softened the edges of his long hands. He opened the door to her as if she were someone he had been waiting for. They had met over a will years ago. He had been quiet then, precise. He had the look of a man who knew where to find facts in a pile of sentiment. "I suppose you heard," he said without preamble, leading her to a seat among the potted herbs. "Yes," she answered simply. The sentence was a load-bearing beam. He folded his hands like someone who had practiced patience as a profession. "Tell me what you know." She told him everything she would tell none, the bank message, the photograph in Rome, the joint account she had not authorized, the strange signatures. She told him about the will folded in cedar and the frightened smallness she felt when it occurred to her the person she had trusted most had taken from her. Walter listened like he had always listened, careful breath, a type of legal silence that was almost prayer. When she finished, he did not offer any rush of reassurance. He offered instead the kindling of a plan that had law at its spine. "It sounds like fraud," Walter said. "It sounds like forgery. But those words are only the beginning. What we need is to document everything. Statements, the will, any correspondence. I can look at the signatures. If there's something false, if something's been manufactured, we take it to the proper channel, quietly, methodically." Ellie wrote his words down. She liked the way methodical sounded. It fit the contours of the life she had built. Steady, patient, composed. She thought of the phrase, calm before the storm, and that was not the weather she wanted. She wanted a steady, civil reckoning. Before she left, Walter gave her a small envelope with his card and a note in careful script. "No theatrics. The law loves facts." Ellie tucked the envelope into her red notebook as though it were a prayer. At the train platform, she watched a young mother with a toddler laugh at something minor and ordinary and felt almost jealous of the way life could go on without having to be examined. She threaded that feeling into the notebook too, and then closed it. The diagnosis came the week after. Dr. Hall was not dramatic. He had the practiced softness of someone who gave people bad news for a living and then sat out the silence until it had softened enough to be named. Ellie sat in the consultation room, hands in her lap, and watched his mouth find the words it had to. "Leukemia," he said. "We will have to do tests. It can be treated. There is a timeline we have to consider. The way his words landed was not cinematic. There were no violins, no gasps. There was a small, clinical fan on the wall whirring like an indifferent thing. Ellie listened. She had loved people who were sick. She had buried friends. She had watched the tide of life take people the way the sea takes a sandcastle. There was a certain grain to being an elder. You get news, and you measure it with other important things. Days you want to spend with a neighbor, bread you should remember to thaw for dinner, an old photograph that needs to be fixed. Back home, she brewed chamomile with the attention of someone adjusting a compass. The kettle hissed, steam like breath. She wrote in the red notebook, 6 months, and then she closed the page like a judge closing a file. The diagnosis clarified rather than frightened. It made her timeline neat. She had known, in some unspoken way, that the choice facing her would be decided by how much time she had. She did not want to spend her allotted months in furious scenes. She did not want to die with a headache of shame. She wanted to arrange truth like flowers in a vase. She told Walter when she went back. He did not flinch. All the more reason, he said, to have this done right. His eyes were kind in a way that did not ask for drama. You choose the outcome, we choose the method. We will follow the facts. It would be tempting, in a smaller telling, to make Ellie implode under the weight. But she had always been constructed of other people's small dependable acts. A neighbor's casserole, a teacher's patience, a policeman not making assumptions about boys with backpacks. She had mended more than coats in her life. She had mended moments where people could not see their own need. Now she set the tools for mending differently. She would not chase them across currency forms and overseas flights. She would rely on law and on the habits of people who could recognize forgery and lies. The red notebook became her ledger and her prayer. She scribbled a quick line in the margin that night. 6 months is enough. For what I have to do, it's more than enough. It read like a dare to herself. Ellie made a list of legal steps the way she had once made a list for Thanksgiving ingredients. She would file a complaint of elder financial abuse. She would present the will and the signatures to a lawyer. She would ask the bank to freeze suspicious transfers. She would document every photo, message, and call. No theatrics. Walter said the law could look like justice if given time and facts. She trusted him in the same way she had trusted a map when roads were unfamiliar. There was another element she could not ignore, the court of public opinion. Tanya and Rhonda had built their lives to be visible. They posted photographs like little flags, images of shopping sprees and sunset glasses of wine that made the people who saw them either seethe or envy. In a world where postings can be subpoenas, where a smiling plate of pasta can be evidence of an unearned feast, Ellie decided to let visibility do some work for her. She would not be the one to shout. She would let the truth, once collected, find a way to be visible. She thought of the Instagram photo and the way a single square could betray more than a life. She had no desire for spectacle, but social evidence, handled correctly, had the power to be factual and unadorned. Brenda arranged documents. Walter called an old friend in the local bank's legal department and asked for a hold on transfers under suspicion of fraud. The bank's reaction was a practical shrug at first, procedures, but once a lawyer with Walter's pedigree called, the same procedures softened into a readiness. The mechanics of bureaucracy were not poetry, but they were useful here. Ellie sat in the hallway at the bank and watched young clerks move in a rhythm she had once found intimidating and now found almost comforting. She made the list of people to contact. Walter, Brenda, a neighbor who had a scanner, the name she had noted in the back of the red notebook, Mr. Ernest, the federal contact Walter had mentioned in passing, a man who Walter promised knew how to make an account freeze ripple across an ocean if necessary. Ellie did not like bureaucracies for their own sake, but she understood systems. They were like gardens. If you know the soil, things grow differently. Jackson's life continued on a postcard. Rome, posted like a holiday dream. Ellie's friends would sometimes whisper that perhaps she should forgive, that perhaps he was just caught in the tide of youth and mistake. Forgiveness was not off the table, but debt, whether of a bank account or of a son's conscience, required accounting. She had raised him to be better than this. A quiet ending, she thought, would be a better teacher. Ellie spent the following week cataloging. She sat at her kitchen table and spread things out in a manner that might have looked overzealous to a casual observer. Receipts, old letters, a dog-eared school program, a greased-stained postcard of a lighthouse Jackson had once painted. She took photos with the phone and wrote a careful note for each. She labeled them in the notebook: evidence, date, context. The red notebook became like a ledger of grief and a map of procedure. Each entry calmed her a little. Each documented truth made her feel less like a victim and more like someone laying down markers. There were moments when the old maternal reflex rose like a tide. She would find a shirt in the laundry that still smelled of Jackson's cologne, cheap, but it reminded her of him, and then she would tuck it away instead of burning it. "He is still my son," she wrote under the line where she had listed transactions. "I will not wage war. I will ask him to answer." A part of her wanted a scene where all the small things were returned, where an apology arrived like a bouquet. That part of her was a young woman back in a kitchen with a newborn whose forehead needed cooling. But the book of life does not always offer pages in order. What it did offer now was time enough to do right by herself. The first real legal steps were procedural and cold. Walter drafted a letter to the bank and the police. He included copies of the will and the odd forms she had found folded in the armchair. Brenda scanned the receipts and printed the Instagram photo in color so the layout of the image could be preserved as evidence, rather than a glowing rectangle on a phone. They took the yellow envelope with its old photographs and wedding program down to Walter's office and made a careful inventory. Each object was cataloged like a relic in a museum, given provenance and a place on the record. Ellie thought often of what dignity might look like at the end of her life. She did not want vindication as a trumpet. She wanted a truth that would be clear and quiet, an accounting that would attend to the harm she had been done. She thought about the phrase that came to mind, perfect revenge. It sounded carnal and small on the page, like a magazine headline. In her mouth, the words shifted. Perfect revenge would look like a truth told plainly, a responsibility taken, a son given the chance to make amends in the light rather than under the unforgiving shadow of a scandal. It would be public, because evidence is public, but it would not be theatrical. It would be just. There were nights when she opened the red notebook and wrote one line and closed it as if closing a prayer. One of those lines was shorter than most. I smiled. It felt right. She was not giggling with delight. The smile was the kind of quiet that can be felt in the bones. It was not cruel. It was recognition that she had chosen dignity over a tantrum, patience over ruin.
She had been handed a story. She would write it with the steadiness she had used to wash dishes and sew hems. If you want to see how a quiet mother turned betrayal into justice, stay with me until the end. The invitation was hush and not a plea, just a fact as firm as the pages she turned. There was still so much to do. There would be meetings with people who handled fraud, conversations with clerks who could put holds on accounts, the assembling of pictures and the list of transfers so the authorities could follow the thread. There would be a time, Walter said, when they might have to call someone like Mr. Ernest. He said the words quietly, like a man saying a name he knew could be used to start engines. Ellie did not tell anyone she had a letter planned for Jackson. She kept it in the back of the red notebook like a seed not yet planted. She wrote lines, short ones, the kind that landed like small stones in a pond. Remember the sweater I knitted that he refused to wear. Remember the time he cried after failing an exam, and she sat with him until dawn. The letter would not be an attempt to shame, she decided. It would be a mirror. It would show him the person he had been and the person he could be if he bore the cost of his actions. The first round of paperwork moved with the slowness of a winter train. There would be hearings if needed. There would be subpoenas and signatures. There would be a freeze, perhaps, or a hold. Walter explained the options without telling her what she wanted to hear or what would hurt her most. He was a man of law, and law is a kind of kindness for those who cannot afford, of temperament or money, the melodrama of courts. And then there was the small, delicious work of memory. Ellie sat in the square of morning light on the porch and sorted photographs into piles. There were the black and white ones with the mustached man she thought of as a ghost sometimes. There were the ones of Jackson at his high school graduation with a cap askew that someone had straightened with a finger of pride. She placed a few in an envelope she had colored with a green highlighter, the kind of ridiculous flourish that made her laugh. It was an old habit, making even the small things pretty. She wrote a line for the letter and ran her finger along the ink as if testing its permanence. Jackson's picture on her phone blinked from Rome, blissfully unaware of the weather back home. He posted another image, a sunset, a glass of wine raised to some invisible companion. The world, as the young see it, was a series of brilliant moments laid end to end. Ellie thought of how easy it is, when one is young and full of the future, to believe that small acts can slide into place without consequence. She had once been like that, perhaps, though her memory of those years was mostly a kind of endurance.
3 weeks into the process, there was a knocking, legal, clean, on the door of Jackson's life, an official notice from the bank requesting information about recent transfers, and an intent to place a review. The sort of officialness that lives in browned envelopes had a way of sounding older and more final than an angry voice. It is one of the small truths of the world that paperwork can make a louder sound than any shout. Ellie watched the sun slant through the kitchen window, lighting the dust motes like small galaxies, and let the small shimmering calm settle over her. She made another note in the red notebook. Keep the yellow envelope safe. Add letter. Keep calendar for meetings. Cross forgery check off the list once Walter called to say they had requested handwriting analysis. And still, the world kept being ordinary in ways she loved. The mail came, someone mowed the neighbor's lawn, a boy rode his bicycle down the street and did not have to think about bank balances. Those ordinary things were not trivial. They were scaffolding for the life she had chosen to hold on to. She would not let the rest of her life be consumed by the theft. She would live in the small, faithful way she had always lived, visiting the library on Thursdays, baking a loaf of bread when it rained, feeding the cat who had adopted the house and never asked for a bank statement. There would come a time when the consequences of the transfers would reach Jackson, when a card would be denied, when a merchant would call to report an issue, when a passport might be called into question. But that time had not yet arrived. For now, there was only the work of assembling truth and of making a place for the voice she wanted to leave him when everything had to be said plainly. She wrote in the red notebook one more short line that evening and snapped it closed. The line was a quiet exultation. Perfect revenge does not break people, it shows them who they have become. She set the book by the lamp and drank chamomile until her mouth tasted of the light. She was not eager for spectacle. She wanted rather for the truth to find its footing slowly and to ask for account. She wanted Jackson to come home and to answer, not to flee. Outside the window, the world continued. Somewhere in Rome, a fountain threw water up into the air, and it fell back down into the pool in 100 tiny promises. Inside, under a roof patched last winter with her own hands, Ellie Price began to make a list that would take her across a few months and through many small doors. She had 6 months, the doctor had said. That felt somehow like enough. She folded the letter she had begun for Jackson into the back of the red notebook, set the yellow envelope on top of it, and put the whole into the drawer beneath the armchair. Then she pulled out a small photograph of Jackson from when he was 7, mud on his knees, a grin full of missing teeth, and smoothed the creases until they lay flat.
Walter called that night and said they had a next step, a formal request to the bank to place a temporary hold on the account in question until an investigation could be conducted. He said the words with legal exactitude, that Ellie heard the promise beneath them. She said, "Thank you," which is what she always said to him. Then she added, unexpectedly, "Make sure he sees the letter." There was a long pause at the other end of the line, a sound like a man who had thought about the ethics of forcing a painful truth into mind. Walter cleared his throat. "We will." He was a man of law, and he knew how hard it could be to place obligation in a human chest. That night, Ellie placed the red notebook on the coffee table, the cover catching moonlight like a small comet. She sat up too late reading through older entries, lists of birthdays, notes on the best pickled cucumbers, a line from a song she had hummed to Jackson when he was small. She found herself smiling again. It was not the smile of malice. It was the smile of a woman who knew how to assemble the facts and then, with a steady hand, put an end to something ugly. Her body, older and softer than it had been, was tired enough to sleep, but her mind was a small lantern, lit and careful. She went to bed that night with the letter pressing a little on her chest, like a stone that keeps time. Somewhere beyond the borders of her street, Jackson lifted a glass to the sky and thought of nothing at all. Morning came, and the first official letter arrived from the bank in a heavy envelope stamped with the institution's seal. The words inside were the kind of bureaucratic music that makes change inevitable. Review, hold, investigation. Ellie read them with an odd, close attention, as if watching a plant unfurl. She made a cup of chamomile and sat with the paper like one might sit with a child who had misbehaved and now needed a serious talk. It was a small victory. It was not everything, but it was a first stone laid in a path that would, she hoped, lead where truth needed to go. She put the letter back into the red notebook and closed it. Outside, the street smelled fresh, as if the world had forgiven itself for some minor infraction. Inside, Ellie sat by the window and thought about the Trevi Fountain photograph. She thought about the way water falls, and how it can gather many truths in its basin. She smiled again, not the sharp smile of the headline, but a wider, softer one that seemed to include welcome and farewell in the same motion. The red notebook rested like a heart on the coffee table. She had started something that had the shape of justice, the kind that arrives in forms and letters and waits for people to answer. There was much to come, papers to file, people to meet, perhaps a plane across the sea that would bring his son back to stand in a room he had once fled.
But that, she thought, with the kind of quiet certainty that can sometimes only come after grief arrives like weather, would be for later. For now, she had arranged her small pieces. She had her chamomile tea, she had her lists, she had her friends, Brenda with her accounting precision, Walter with his patient law, and she had the red notebook where she wrote in a line that felt like a benediction, "I smiled, I made lists, I will not ruin him, I will make him reckon." Outside, someone clipped a hedge. Beside her, on the shelf, an old tin of sewing needles glinted. The morning light found them both and turned them ordinary and redemptive. She closed her eyes briefly and felt the steady breathing of a life that had always been a mediation between giving and holding. Then she opened her eyes, took the teacup to the sink, and began the small work of preparing for the next meeting. The rest, she thought, would be history and truth taking their slow, inevitable steps. The rest, she thought, would be history and truth taking their slow, inevitable steps. If bureaucracy had a rhythm, Ellie learned to listen to it. After Walter's phone call, papers moved in a way that felt almost polite. Stamps appeared, a clerk's signature inked like an apostrophe on a sentence. Mr. Ernest, Walter's old federal contact, took the file with a seriousness that was neither theatrical nor casual. It was the kind of attention reserved for matters that could travel across borders. He said little when he took the red notebook in his large hands, but when he looked up, his eyes held the small, steady light of someone who had seen a lot of human smallness and a few hard truths. "We'll put a watch on things," he said. "No promises on timing, but we put flags where they need to be." His words were technical without being cold. Ellie nodded, and at home that evening she wrote his name down. Mr. Ernest, Federal. She added a date and the small satisfaction of a thing checked off a list. Meanwhile, Jackson's life began to tighten like a knot. Rome was still sun and tourists and the small, echoing footsteps of someone who had thought they were unaccountable. His credit card was declined at a market stall when he tried to buy coffee, an awkward human moment captured in a terse exchange. Card out, vendor frowning, transaction denied. He laughed it off then. In the early stages of consequences, people often treat them like weather, temporary and mildly inconvenient. A few days later, he received an email that made the laugh stop, a request for information from his bank about transfers in and out of accounts associated with his name, and a notice that his account was under review. Tanya's messages, at first concerned, became clipped. Rhonda's calls were fewer and more guarded. Jackson tried to call his mother twice in a week and hung up both times before listening to her recorded voicemail. He did not want the old voice suggesting, measuring, judging.
He wanted to duck. He wanted explanations he had not prepared himself to give. Small humiliations accrued. A reservation at a trattoria, made under his name, was held asking for a deposit he suddenly could not cover. A hotel cleaner told him to leave keys at the desk. Friends who had been picked up in photos later that month with him in front of monuments sent polite distance in the form of unanswered messages. The world, which had seemed like a chain of bright moments, began to show small, thin seams. On the other side of the ocean, social media did what it does in the gray places between public and private. Images became evidence. Someone who had followed Tanya posted a screenshot to a private group with the caption, "Isn't that Ellie Price's son?" The screenshot grew and moved, then splintered into other feeds, where an unflattering juxtaposition, Jackson in Rome, an old woman in a quiet house, started to be noted by people who loved to zero in on contradictions. The posts were not hateful, at least not at first. They were curious, then suspicious, then clarifying. When Brenda printed out one of the threads and placed it in the red notebook between 2 pages of dates, Ellie did not enjoy the sight of the glowing rectangles in a printed cut-and-paste kind of way, but she felt the steadiness of a fact. Now other people could see what had once been only her private proof. Tanya and Rhonda tried to handle the first tremors with indignation and blame. In a video call that Jackson took from a small rented apartment in Rome, they argued about whether it was right to inform his mother of anything. Tanya's voice took on a sharpness Ellie had never liked, an air of ownership, and Rhonda's laughter when she thought no one could hear it carried the brittle quality of someone who had loved the way the world looked when it reflected her. They urged Jackson to deny, to file counters, to claim mistake. He tried both options in rapid succession. Denial, then an apology sent in a messy late-night text that said in part, "I didn't mean to. It's complicated. Mom will understand." Ellie read none of that until later. Reading his words without context felt like pulling a bandage off slowly enough to avoid a jagged sound.
At home, the chemo plan arrived in the mail with the same matter-of-factness as a municipal notice. There was an appointment card, a list of what to bring, a phone number for questions. Ellie folded the card into the red notebook, closed it, and thought about the line she had written there earlier. 6 months is enough. The truth of it settled again like a calm. She would let the treatment run its course on the body as she let the law run its course on the theft. Both things asked patience. The day before her first treatment, she asked Brenda to sit with her. They made chamomile and peeled apples and spoke about nothing urgent.
Ellie had decided she would shave her head before the first infusion because she wanted a measure of control in a situation that otherwise handed her to doctors and needles and waiting rooms. It was less dramatic than most people imagined. It was a small, intimate task. She sat in Walter's kitchen where Brenda had lent the time and a pair of clippers. The first pass of the clippers sounded like a small machine at work. Hair fell like confetti. Her scalp felt cool, and then warmer as the season moved through it. Ellie looked at her reflection and shrugged a little. She was not making a spectacle. The small bulbs of her hair in a bowl were like the small, private things she had always kept in drawers, objects of passing grief and quiet acceptance. "I look like a volunteer at a hospital," she joked, when a thread of humor rose. Brenda laughed and tucked a stray curl behind Ellie's ear, a ridiculous motion that had once felt maternal in a soft, uncomplicated way. When she left the clippings in a tissue, Ellie folded the tissue and tucked it into the red notebook between 2 pages. It felt like a relic. She wrote one line after the cut, "Ready." While Ellie was learning the steadiness of the infusion chair, Walter and Mr. Ernest moved the legal pieces across a map that, for her, remained mostly invisible. Mr. Ernest called from time to time with updates that were brief and precise. There had been an interbank inquiry. Banks in a couple of jurisdictions had placed holds pending verification. Local authorities in Rome had been alerted to check for suspicious receipts linked to Jackson's accounts. He used the language of procedure again, but Ellie heard in it the sound of something being put right. There was the inevitable public ripple. An investigative morning show picked up a small piece, a matter-of-fact report that was careful to say alleged and under investigation and no charges yet. It printed the posted vacation photos and matched them with the young woman's name and the list of transfers. The piece did not try to humiliate. It translated discrepancy into question. But the effect was visible. Comments that called for accountability swelled. A local civic group reached out with offers of help and condolences. For Ellie, the world shifted into more witness than solitude. At the embassy, the consular officer who eventually met Jackson was a woman with a low, efficient voice and a small stack of procedures in a folder. She did not look at him with moral outrage. She looked at him with something that made him feel small, professional expectation. There were forms to sign, and he found his hand capable of signing. The officer explained that a pending international review might complicate his plans. She said it slowly, as though speaking to someone who had not yet learned the sound of consequences. She asked if he had representation. He did not. She offered him resources and, finally, told him he was required to return to the country for an initial inquiry if his presence was requested. There was not a shout in the room, only the dry, polite language of consular duty. An image of Ellie in the courtroom or on TV did not appear. Instead, she chose to be present in a room that felt more like a small civil translation of responsibility, the embassy's conference space, where an American official read a prepared note, and where a bank lawyer, on a video call, careful and direct, presented the list of transfers and the documents that Walter had provided. There was a bank representative, a consulate official, Mr. Ernest on speaker, and Jackson on the other side of a thin table, stunned in a way that made his face younger. Ellie sat in a chair near the window. Sunlight softened the outline of the room. She had come because she wanted to see him answer. He tried first to explain. He said it had been a mistake, a misreading of numbers, a hasty assumption that money could be moved like a line on a spreadsheet with no one hurt. The bank's lawyer listened and pointed to dates. The consular officer asked him if he had access to the accounts and whether he had signed any documents authorizing transfers. There was no loud accusation. There was a request for truth. Jackson's mouth worked. He looked at Tanya, who sat a row behind him with Rhonda, hands clenched into the kind of small, private fists people make when they do not know how to speak. The moment when Jackson's pen met a paper in that room felt less like a dramatic confession than a quiet, inevitable accounting. He signed documents acknowledging he would cooperate with the review, that he would provide access to any accounts in his name, and that he would accept administrative actions the bank deems appropriate pending legal findings. The words, "I acknowledge," were in print, and he signed them. He did not shout, "I'm sorry," the way a scene in a film demands. He simply signed, and the weight of a signature in that air was like a sentence pronounced by a tribunal, only because the world agreed that paper could be a thing that asks for truth. Ellie watched his hand. She felt an old, deep version of sorrow, an ache that had nothing to do with bank balances, and everything to do with what it costs to love someone and have them choose poorly. After the papers were finished and the room breathed out in small administrative relief, she reached into the inside pocket of her coat where the yellow envelope lay in the red notebook. She had folded the letter again and again until it fit the exactness of her palm. When she handed the envelope to Jackson, she did not dramatize the act. Her fingers slid it across the table like something that had been on the table for a long time. A household bill, a list of names, a recipe. He took it and opened it with a kind of reverence that had nothing to do with the good of his choices.
Inside were 3 things. A photograph of him at 7 with the cowlick that would not be tamed, a pressed circus ticket, tiny, red, and a folded letter written in a hand that trembled only slightly. The letter was short. There was no sermon. 2 lines were the whole of it, chosen to pierce the small deflections of his defenses. Remember how you learned to tie your shoes. You practiced until your fingers hurt. You were patient with yourself. Come home and be patient with the truth. She had written other things in the notebook, but this letter was chosen for its small, exact hurt. It was not browbeating. It was a mirror. He looked at his mother's face across the table, lines around her mouth softened by illness, the small scar on her upper lip he had not noticed since childhood, and his expression changed in a way that was almost transparent. Embarrassment spilled into regret, and regret into an ache that had no language. There is a power in being visible without malice. Ellie did not seek the mortification of her son. She sought the daylight of fact. She wanted him to return, to answer questions, to repay what he could, and to learn the cost of a thing taken. The confluence of legal consequence and the quiet truth she offered, handing him the pieces of his childhood, was what she called, when she thought the words privately, her perfect revenge. It was not cruelty. It was a teacher's test. The fallout continued, slow as winter. Back home, neighbors murmured, and some of Jackson's friends turned away. Tanya and Rhonda paced in Rome like birds that had lost their promise of easy refuge. They blamed one another in private, and in public rehearsed claims of ignorance. In small ways, their social life tightened. People who had once admired their brashness now saw a seam in the fabric of their persona. There was no mob. There was the restructuring of relationships, mercifully human and never spectacular. Ellie returned home after the embassy sitting. The plane ride soothed her in the way trains had once done when Jackson was a child, and she traveled for an unexpectedly short weekend with him. She walked through her door and the house smelled of lemon polish. Doris had left a pot roast on the stove, and Brenda had straightened 2 chairs until their spindles shone. The cat walked the perimeter as if inspecting a territory lately reinforced. Her treatments continued, and the days stretched like small intervals of sunlight. Neighbors came by with casseroles and knitting. Children from down the street popped in to check on their favorite storyteller. A woman Ellie had never met dropped off a small plant with a card that read for strength. These things did not solve the financial losses, but they were scaffolding for a life that at the end wanted witness more than pity. As autumn came on, Ellie grew thinner.
She kept the red notebook in a drawer that was easy to reach and wrote small notes in the margins. Tuesday, blood work. Thursday, librarian talk. Friday, Brenda over for tea. She wrote the small duties that made her days feel arranged rather than adrift. Often she would write one of the shorter first-person lines, the whisper she kept as a private refrain. I smiled. These lines were like prayers that did not ask to be answered, only recognized. Jackson, stripped of some comforts and stripped too of the invisible armor of impunity, began the labor of making things right in small ways. The bank arranged for partial reversals where possible, and accounts were reconciled with the cautious arithmetic of people who had been wronged. There was no large cinematic restitution. The legal process cared for facts, not fashion. Jackson made phone calls he had once avoided. He sat at tables with lawyers and accountants, and sometimes simply with people who were owed explanations. He called his mother on days when the sky in Rome was too loud, or when his ankle ached from too many street steps. His calls were awkward at first, apologies threaded like a cheap scarf, but persistence has a way of stitching change if people are willing to sit with the stitches. The day Ellie understood that her body was growing too fragile to carry the sushi toasts of recovery, she called Walter and told him to mind the folder in his safe. If anything happens, she said, not melodramatically, but with the measured care of a woman who had always kept her documents in order. Make sure the yellow envelope is given to Jackson at the right time. Not now, when it's necessary. Walter thanked her and understood the economy of the request. He had been her steward in paper and law. He would be her steward in the passage that followed. Ellie's last months were a series of small, brilliant domesticities. She read in the afternoons. The library's large print selection became a friend. She listened to the birds from the porch and traced the pattern of mail delivered. She baked when she felt able, which was less often. When she could not, Doris and Brenda left Brad warm on the counter. On one late afternoon, when the light had the glint of wine and the street smelled of cut grass, Jackson came home, not with grand declarations, but with the simple act of bringing over a bag of groceries and a bouquet of cheap supermarket daisies. He set them on the kitchen table and waited. He knelt in front of her as if kneeling in the way boys do before a small altar, awkward, earnest, and tied a shoelace in a way he had not in years, the knot clumsy but well-intentioned. He said he was sorry. He said it in a small voice. He asked if she forgave him. Ellie looked at him with a kind of clarity that made the room flush warm. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said simply, "but I will not be puzzled for you. You have to make peace with the accounts, with the things you took."
Forgiveness doesn't mean there's no consequence. His face split with the slow release of a person dropping a weight he had been carrying wrong. He nodded until his head hardly moved. He began, in small, determined steps, to pay back what he could, to work, to ask friends for odd jobs. He did things that were not heroic. He mowed a neighbor's lawn, fixed a gate, learned the humbling skill of honest labor. He left, sometimes, a box of donuts on Ellie's porch in the early morning, with a note that said nothing more than, "Thinking of you." The donuts were small offerings. They were not reparations. They were attempts at presence. On a crisp morning when the maples tipped their leaves into flame, Ellie's breathing grew shallow. She did not make a sudden, violent scene. She had prepared herself with small, tidy instructions. Call Brenda. Tell Walter there were a few loose documents in the drawer that needed to be filed. Give Jackson the red notebook if he had not already found it. The things she left were practical as well as sentimental. When she died, it was at home, in the place she had kept in order. A handkerchief on the pillow, the cat curled by her feet, Doris in the next room. She had a neighbor hold her hand in the last hour, a sober, human touch that meant more than 1,000 words. She was not alone. It was quiet, and the sort of dignity that comes from being tended.
But the pattern he learned was that shame could be turned into action if someone had the courage to stay and do the work. People in the neighborhood spoke of Ellie in the way you speak of a lighthouse. Her light had been steady rather than flashy, and people took comfort in it. There was talk, sometimes, that the world was complicated and that the law had been a kind friend to a small woman who had found the courage to use it. Tanya and Rhonda moved on in a way that left a few friends puzzled. They had to renegotiate how they would be seen in public, and the story of what happened followed them like a small shadow. Months later, in the quiet of an ordinary evening, Jackson sat in Ellie's armchair. It smelled, faintly, of lemon polish and chamomile. He had brought a small box of donuts and left him on the table without making a show of it. He opened the red notebook and read his mother's handwriting, the neat loops, the tiny corrections made without fuss. The page where she had written, "I smiled," made his heart ache so fiercely he had to close the book and let his forehead rest on it for a long time. In the front of the notebook, she had kept a few instructions for life. In the back, she had kept simple, intimate fragments that were less instruction and more inheritance. The way to fix a frayed collar, where the old tin of needles lived, and a short list of songs she liked to hum while mending. He read them slowly, as if learning an unfamiliar language. He read the small letter he had been handed in Rome again and again, until the lines were not just words, but a way of seeing who he had been and could still be. Years moved the neighborhood along. The legal case, when it closed, recommended restitution where possible and censured misappropriation. The public attention faded like a tide, and people returned to their ordinary kindness. Jackson found work that paid modestly but kept him busy. He came by sometimes with pastries and waits to sit in the chair where his mother had mended sweaters and watch seasons change. He spoke to people differently now, with a patience that felt new. On a rainy afternoon, when the light lay soft over the street, Jackson penned a note of his own. He folded it and slipped it into the red notebook where his mother had once tucked the yellow envelope. He did it not to erase what had happened, but to answer it in the only way he had left, with steadiness and a willingness to be seen honestly.
The red notebook remained on the coffee table like a small altar, neither shrine nor relic, but a record. People sometimes asked, in the neighborhood or online when they spoke of the old woman who had been wronged, whether what had happened to Ellie had been revenge or justice. It was a question that had to do with language. Ellie, who had often read in the margins of things where the verbs mattered, would have had an answer that was short and neat.
One night, sitting by the window where the leaves shimmered metallic in the lamplight, Jackson wrote one last line in the red notebook, in a hand more steady than it had been the year before. It was an echoing of the refrain she had left him with, but turned into a promise. "I saw her smile," he wrote, "and I learned to answer for what I have done." He closed the book, and for the first time in a long time, felt the small satisfaction of a thing admitted. It was not absolution. It was not spectacle. It was the quiet, difficult work of living with consequence and trying to be better. The story of Ellie Price spread in small ways, through those who had known her, through the children she had told stories to at the library, through a single paragraph in a local paper that remembered her for steady hands and chamomile tea. People commented on how a woman who had been slight and ordinary had done extraordinary things. She had collected facts, she had insisted on truth, and she had left those she loved with the chance to answer. Some called it revenge. Ellie, in the small way she used the word privately, had called it simply what it was, the restoration of order and a final education for a son. If the headline had been loud, "My son cleared my bank account and took off with his wife and mother-in-law," Ellie's life beneath it was quieter. Chamomile cups, a trimmed garden, neighbors who brought casseroles, and small acts of attention. The perfect revenge, when one looked at it without sensationalism, was both smaller and more humane than the headline suggested. It was not about breaking a person. It was about giving a person the chance to be accountable, and then watching how they chose to live with that knowledge. "I smiled," she had written in the red notebook, and meant it with the steady calm of someone who had done all she could to set things right. If this story reached you, perhaps you have a memory to share of standing up for truth, of quiet acts of repair, of the slow dignity of people learning to answer for themselves. Leave your thoughts below with kindness, and if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that remember the small dignity of ordinary lives, subscribe and come back for the next one.